Before you go any further, drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. We love seeing where our Crimson Secrets family is tuning in from. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We post new stories every week. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's talk about what happened to Leonora Westing on the night her husband stood up their anniversary dinner in front of 40 people and told her she had become an embarrassment to his name. The envelope was sitting on the kitchen counter. When Leonora Westing got home that Tuesday evening, she noticed it immediately because it was the only thing on the counter. Adrian kept the kitchen spotless, not out of domesticity, but out of control. Every surface in the house reflected something about him, chosen, deliberate, arranged. The envelope, cream-colored and unsealed, had her name written across the front in his handwriting. Not Nora. Not the name he used when he wanted something from her. Leonora. All 4 syllables, like a legal document. She set her bag down. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, at the hydrangeas she had planted the first spring they lived there, now overgrown and going gray at the edges, because no one had touched them in 2 years. She thought about the drive home. The way the sky had turned that particular bruised purple over the interstate, the kind of color that happens in October, when the light gives up earlier than you expect it to. She thought about the meeting she had sat through that afternoon. 4 hours in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a building in downtown Boston, and the number that had been written on the whiteboard at the end of it, a number that still didn't feel real to her. Numbers that large never did at first. Then she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Adrian Croft had always been efficient with words when it suited him. I've spokens will be filed Thursday. I'll be staying at the Mandarin until the process is finalized. I trust you'll conduct yourself with some dignity for once. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease, set it back on the counter, and went upstairs to change out of her work clothes. To understand what happened to Leonora and Adrian, you have to understand what their marriage had actually been. Not the version Adrian performed at dinner parties and industry events, but the one that lived behind the walls of that house in Brookline. They had met 14 years ago, when Leonora Westing was 31 and newly hired as a research biochemist at a mid-sized pharmaceutical firm called Caldwell Partners. Adrian Croft was the company's VP of Business Development. Charming, polished, the kind of man who filled a room without raising his voice. He had pursued her with a precision she had mistaken at the time for devotion. In the first years, he had been proud of her work in a way that felt genuine. He would tell people at parties, "My wife is the smartest person in any room she walks into," and Leonora had loved him for it. Loved the warmth of being seen by someone she admired. What she hadn't understood then, what took her nearly a decade to fully comprehend, was that Adrian's admiration had always carried a ceiling. He was proud of her the way some people are proud of a talented child. Fondly, conditionally, with quiet self-assumption that she would never actually surpass them. When her research started getting real attention, when her name started appearing in journals and at conferences, when Caldwell Partners gave her her own team and a budget that exceeded his, the pride had curdled, slowly at first. A comment at dinner about how she'd been abrasive with a colleague. A question, gently posed, about whether she was sure she wanted to push for the patent in her own name rather than the company's. A suggestion offered over wine one Saturday night, that maybe the position at the smaller firm in Connecticut would be a better fit. More manageable, he said, more sustainable for you. She had stayed. She had tried. She had gone to couples counseling twice, both times alone after the second session. Because Adrian found the therapist reductive. She had softened herself in rooms where she used to speak freely. She had come home to that spotless kitchen and eaten dinners where he talked about his words in the way you listen to a forecast for weather in a city you'll never visit. What she had never done, and this she was certain of, was give up on the research. The compound she had been developing for the past 3 years had started as a footnote. A molecular anomaly her team had flagged during a routine trial and almost discarded. Leonora had flagged it back. She had a habit of not letting things go that other people didn't know what to do with. She brought it home with her in the way scientists bring certain problems home, not minds, in files, but in the back of the mind, present at breakfast and at 2 in the morning, and in the shower and on the drive to work socks. Separate from the company system, careful dated, documented the way her graduate advisor had taught her, as if someone will try to take it from you someday, because they might. By the time Adrian handed her that envelope, she was 6 weeks away from a licensing agreement that would revalue her life so completely that she hadn't yet found the right framework to hold it in. She hadn't told him, not because she was hiding it, though looking back, she understood she had been protecting it from him without fully naming it that way. She hadn't told him because he had stopped being the kind of person she brought good news to. You learn over the years which people in your life can hold your joy without diminishing it. Adrian had not been that person for a long time. The anniversary dinner had been 2 months earlier. They had gone to Sable, a restaurant on Newbury Street that Adrian had chosen because a client of his had been there and described the wine list in favorable terms. Leonora had worn the gray dress he'd given her for her birthday. She'd noticed, without comment, that he had a habit of giving her things that reflected his taste rather than hers, and they had arrived 10 minutes late because he had taken a call in the car and made no move to end it. There were 8 other couples at the dinner, friends of Adrian's, mostly. A few she liked. Most she'd simply grown accustomed to. She didn't remember exactly what she had said. She had made a comment, a light one, she thought, about a merger that one of the other guests had brought up. Something she knew more about than the conversation seemed to assume. She had offered a correction, or she hadn't thought much of it. Adrian had set down his fork. "I want to apologize for my wife," he said. The table had gone. Not the polite quiet of a pause in conversation, the kind of quiet that happens when something has crossed a line no one can pretend wasn't there. "She has a bad habit," he continued, his voice perfectly even, "of speaking on subjects she doesn't fully understand. It's a professional hazard, I suppose. Researchers tend to confuse familiarity with expertise." Leonora had looked at him. She had not looked away. She hadn't cried, though she could feel the heat behind her eyes. She had picked up her wine glass and taken a slow sip, and turned to the woman on her left and resumed a conversation they'd been having about a garden renovation. She had not said another word to Adrian for the remainder of the dinner. In the car on the way home, he had explained that she had been embarrassing him for years, and that he had simply reached his limit. She had looked out the window at the streetlights and thought, 3 weeks, because she had known, by then, not the exact number. The final number wouldn't be confirmed for another 6 weeks, but she had known the shape of what was coming. The licensing meeting had been scheduled. The parties were in place. The compound had cleared every threshold it needed to clear, and the lead counsel for Vantara Biomedical had already told her, privately, that the committee was a formality. She had thought 3 weeks, and felt something settle in her chest that wasn't quite peace, but was adjacent to it. Thursday came, and the papers were filed. Leonora did not contest the timeline. She hired an attorney, a woman named Sasha O'Demba, who had been recommended to her by a colleague, and who, in their first meeting, had looked at the preliminary documentation and asked 3 questions so precise that Leonora had felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was in a room with someone who was fully paying attention. The asset disclosure was the part Adrian had not anticipated. He had assumed she could see the architecture, a assumption in every move he made, that they would divide what was visible. The house, the investment accounts, his pension, her retirement fund. He had structured his opening position accordingly, with a confidence that came from genuinely believing he understood her financial situation. What he hadn't known was that the intellectual property, the compound, the patents, the licensing agreement in progress, was hers. Documented in her name, with timestamps going back 3 years, predating every relevant corporate filing. Sasha had reviewed it all before their second meeting and had said, in a tone that was marital property in any formulation he can successfully argue. The licensing agreement closed on a Thursday afternoon in November. Leonora Westing was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor when it happened, the same building she had looked out over the bruised October sky from weeks before, and the number on the final document was $470 million. She had known it was coming. She had worked toward it for 3 years. She had protected it carefully, documented it obsessively, believed in it on mornings when no one else in her department would have bet $1 on it. And still, when the last signature was placed, and the room filled with the quiet kind of congratulations that serious people offer in serious rooms. Not applause, but nods, the particular nod that means this mattered. She felt something move through her that she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief exactly. It was more like recognition. The feeling of arriving somewhere you had been traveling toward for so long you had stopped noticing the journey. And then looking up and realizing this is the place. She found out about Adrian's reaction secondhand, which was appropriate, she thought. He had been served with the amended financial disclosure the following Monday. His attorney had apparently called Sasha that afternoon and requested an urgent call, which Sasha had declined to take until the scheduled time. Leonora had not been in the room for any of it, but Sasha had summarized it for her with characteristic efficiency. He had not taken it well. There had been a period, a few weeks. She knew him. When Adrian had tried to argue that the research had been conducted mud using marital resources, shared time, the general infrastructure of their domestic life, his attorney had put forward the argument carefully, and Leonora had let Sasha handle it with the documentation that had been meticulously assembled, and the argument had not survived contact with the actual record. She heard through people who moved in the same professional circles that he had told the story several ways. In one version, she had concealed assets. In another, she had been planning the exit for years. In a third, which apparently circulated among certain colleagues of his, she had simply been lucky. The right compound at the right time. She didn't spend much time on these stories. She had work to do. The thing that stayed with her in the months after was not the victory. She had never framed it that way, even to herself. The word felt too small and too loud at the same time, too focused on Adrian, as if the point of all of it had been to defeat him. It hadn't been. It had never been. What stayed with her was a conversation she'd had with her younger sister, Blythe, on the phone 2 nights after the agreement closed. Blythe had asked, did you know when he handed you those papers that this was about to happen? And Leonora had thought about it honestly before she answered, the way she tried to think about everything. I knew it was close, she said. I didn't know exactly when. But you didn't tell him. No. Why not? She had been quiet for a moment. Outside the window of her apartment. She'd been staying in a furnished rental in Cambridge, while the house situation was sorted. There was a maple tree that had held its leaves longer than the others on the street, still orange and stubborn in November, and she had looked at it while she thought about how to say what she actually meant. Because I'd spent 12 years showing him who I was, she said, finally, and he'd spent 12 years deciding I was something smaller. At a certain point, you stop trying to convince people, you just let the work do it. Blythe had been quiet on the other end. Then she said, that's either the most mature thing I've ever heard or the most devastating. Probably both, Leonora said. 6 months after the agreement closed, she took a position leading her own research division, not at Caldwell Partners, but at a new firm she had co-founded with two colleagues she'd trusted for years. Crestfield Biomedical, with offices in Boston and San Diego. The terms of the Ventara licensing deal funded the first 2 years of operations comfortably. The day the office opened, she stood in the empty main room before anyone else arrived. The furniture still in plastic, the whiteboard still blank. All those years of dated entries in blue Jew ink, problems she had turned overs in the dark hours when the house was quiet and Adrian was asleep, and the compound existed only as a question she couldn't stop asking. She thought about her graduate advisor's instruction. Document as if someone will try to take it from you. She had followed that advice, not because she'd known, specifically, what would happen, but because she had understood somewhere in the part of her that stayed clear even when everything else was clouded, that the work was the one thing that was entirely hers. She had protected it accordingly. The hydrangeas, she later heard, had been dug up when the house was staged for sale. Adrian had wanted clean lines for the listing photographs. The landscapers had replaced them with boxwoods, symmetrical, manageable, low maintenance. She heard about it and felt nothing in particular. She hadn't planted them for him. She had planted them because she liked the way hydrangeas change color depending on the acidity of the soil. The same plant, entirely different expression, depending on what it's rooted in. She had always thought that was worth paying attention to. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever stayed quiet while you kept building, if you've ever had someone underestimate what you were capable of, drop a comment below. Tell us what city you're watching from, and if you're not subscribed to Crimson Secrets yet, now is a good time. There's more where this came from.